Hi there, I hope you had a good Christmas. It's time for another Commodore 64 compilation review, and today I'm going to be looking at a compilation that was originally released in 1988 by US Gold. It's called Giants, and it's got 5 games on it, and it cost £12.99 when it was originally released. This one's got particular significance to me because I got this as a Christmas gift or post-Christmas gift. I may have bought it with some money I got for Christmas in 1988, just after I got my Commodore 64 on Christmas Day. So it means it's exactly, or almost exactly, 35 years since I originally looked at this compilation, and now I'm going to look at it again. Let's begin by taking a closer look at the packaging then. Very nicely presented, this one, certainly from the box, and this one is in excellent condition. It almost looks like new. Usually these big box compilations tend to have a bit of wear on them, but on a not too close inspection it looks as good as it did when it was originally released back in 1988. So 35 years have been kind to this one. It's got the big Giants logo on there. You've got the images in the background from some of the games. You can see a car, a bit of a dragon, a BMX, skateboard, things like that, because the 5 games are Rolling Thunder, Gauntlet II, 720 Degrees, Outrun and California games. So 4 arcade ports and one of the epic sports games. You can see those games also listed on the spine there in blue background that is, and on this side with a purple background you've got the logo on the end of one side and the name of the game and the barcode and the system it's for on the end on the other side. It also uses this World Beaters logo, which is used on quite a few US Gold compilations, just basically trying to promote that they're really good, I suppose. Flipping over onto the back, no screenshots for the games, just overview of each game. It says Giants, a mammoth compilation of world beaters, and then it's got an overview of each game: Outrun, 720 Degrees, Gauntlet II, Rolling Thunder and California games. So a different order than they were listed on the front cover, and it's just got some review comments. So for Outrun it's saying, for example, to be blunt, this game is going to outsell everything going this Christmas, a flipping good game, test drive one today, and that was yours, Sinclair. Another comment from Sinclair user on 720 Degrees, and some various other magazine comments. California games, it says, quite simply the apex of computer sports gaming, and that's a quote from Zap. And then it repeats those in other languages. So we've got French there by the looks of it, I think that's German, and that's probably Spanish, I imagine, and the US Gold logo in the bottom right hand corner there. But yeah, no screenshots and no real description of what the games are about. They really are just letting the covers of the games on the front sell themselves, and to be fair, they probably did, because they're all very well known and popular games for this time. Let's now take a look inside the packaging. First we've got the instructions, I'll go back to those in a moment, and we've got 3 cassettes, which is a bit awkward because this box is only really designed to hold 2. So we've got 1 cassette with Outrun on, 1 cassette with California games on. That's because both of those are multi-loads in various formations, which we'll get into in due course. And then the other tape's got the other 3 games on, which is 720 Degrees, Rolling Thunder there, single loads on one side, and then Gauntlet II, which is also a multi-load, is on the other side. So they're reasonably well presented, nothing too spectacular, just a white label with the names of the games on. And then onto the instructions, which are quite comprehensive. I'm not going to unfold them all the way. Time hasn't been quite as kind to these as it has to the box, because there's some Coke stains or coffee stains on them, and also they're a bit dog-eared as well. But we've got the instructions for California games on one side, which are huge, and you've got the details about all the different events, very similar to the original instructions, I imagine, with sort of images of the half pipe there and various images about how to play the different events. You've got the loading instructions top left hand corner there, and on the other side is the instructions for all the other games. So we've got what have we got there? Gauntlet II, we've got 720 Degrees, we've got Rolling Thunder, and I guess Outrun was on the bottom of the first side. It was. That's a bit weird. So we've got Outrun, just that tiny little box about Outrun there, and then the rest of the instructions are on the opposite side. So pretty comprehensive instructions. As I say, time hasn't been particularly kind to them, but that's nothing to be complaining about. Good packaging overall. Probably not ideal that it hasn't got any details about the games on the back cover or any screenshots, but aside from that, they're pretty good. So with that, let's now move on and look at some of the adverts for this compilation, because there were quite a few of them. As one of the big hitters in US Gold's compilation lineup, Giants was advertised extensively in the magazines of the time, especially in the run-up to Christmas 1988. But even after that, it featured in a lot of different adverts, some of which I'm going to be showing now. This is probably the one that's most recognisable, as it featured in all the magazines of the time. It's quite unusual because it's in landscape format, which means as you were flicking through the magazine it would appear sideways on. In terms of the content of this advert, it's pretty much exactly the same as what's featured on the packaging, but the major difference is that the lineup of games is in a completely different order than it is on the packaging, and I've no idea why they decided to swap them around when they actually published the game.
Aside from that, all the text at the top of the advert is exactly what you see on the back cover of the box, and the only other thing this confirms is the prices, which, as I've already said, was $12.99 for the cassette version, and you could also get a disc version for the Spectrum, Commodore 64 and Amstrad for $14.99, which would have been a good investment if you had a disc drive, because a couple of these games have got quite tedious multi-loads. As I mentioned, this compilation did feature a number of other adverts from US Gold, and this one comes from an edition of Zap from 1989, and as you can see, Giants is featured along with Sports World 88, Command Performance and History in the Making, with the company proudly proclaiming that it was #1 for compilations at the bottom of this page. At least on this one, the cover of Giants has the games in the same order as they are on the actual packaging. Another interesting advert I found is this one from Boots. I'm not sure which magazine it came from, but I'm guessing that it came out early 1989 because there's an offer here that closes on February the 28th. 3 compilations are featured, including Giants, Gremlins Mega Games Volume 1 and Oceans In Crowd, and there's a competition or offer with each one. You could buy Mega Games Volume 1 and get a free Gremlin game, you could buy Giants and get a free Kicks game, or you could buy the In Crowd and enter a competition to win a free trip to New York. Based on the contents of these 3 compilations and the offers that accompany them, I think I'd be going for the In Crowd. What's bemusing about this one though is that the lineup of games for Giants is in a different order again. It's not the same order as on the front of the box, but it's also not the same order as on the advert we looked at earlier. It's really strange that it didn't seem to be consistent about the order of the games on these images. And that continues in this advert from the January 1990 edition of Computer and Video Games, so more than a year after the compilation was originally released. It's got another lineup, this time with California games being replaced by World Class Leaderboard. I'm not sure if this is the 16-bit version of the compilation they're displaying, or they had to remove California games for some reason, but I'd never seen this version before. Once again in this advert, US Gold are claiming that they're the unrivaled masters of compilations, and there's 3 other collections shown: Epics Action, Winners and Coin-Op Hits, the latter of which I do own and will probably review at some point in this series. There are probably other adverts out there that feature the Giants compilation, but I think that's enough looking at magazine pages. Let's move on to looking at the games, and the first of those is Rolling Thunder, originally released by US Gold in 1987 and based on the Namco arcade game from 1986. The game's set in New York City around the year 1960, and the elusive Mabu is plotting to conquer the world. Rolling Thunder, the undercover arm of the World Crime Police Organisation, has sent the female secret agent Layla on a special assignment into Geldra's underground headquarters. Her mission was to expose the treacherous conspiracy, but she was captured. WCPO send in the only man who can possibly rescue Layla. He's known by his reputation and codename Albatross. You assume the role of Albatross, and your prime objective is to penetrate and overthrow the secret organisation Geldra, controlled by the sinister Mabu, and also rescue Layla. To achieve your objective, you must pass through 10 levels, jumping over balconies and over obstructions in your path. The guards that you encounter along the way will shoot, punch and drop bombs on you. Most of these attacks cause an instant loss of life. You're armed with a pistol and machine gun, and by entering doors marked with the bullet or gun symbol you can gain extra firepower. You can also enter the doors to hide from guards at strategic moments. If you manage to defeat Geldra's army and capture the command centre, you must confront Mabu in the final showdown. I've not played the original arcade version of this game very much, as I've always found it quite boring, so I can't offer much of a comparison with that, but I think this conversion is probably quite average. The graphics are okay at best. They do loosely resemble the arcade game, but the sprites are quite blocky, and there's a lot of classic C64 brown in the backgrounds after the first couple of levels, with levels 3 and 4 looking very samey. The animation of your player sprite walking is very comical, as are the hooded enemies when they're dancing around on the title and pre-level control centre screens. That intermission screen is pretty cool though, nicely implemented. Aside from Albatross's silly walk, the animation overall is not bad as you duck and jump between the 2 platforms and walk into doors. The music is repetitive, but I don't think it's awful and it is quite memorable. The sound effects are limited to just shots, but to be honest there's not a lot else in the game that needed them. The large in-game status area is well done with lots of information, but it takes up a third of the screen, so as a result the playing area is smaller than it could have been. I remember this game being really hard when I played it when I first got this compilation, and don't recall ever beating the first stage, but you just have to be patient to make progress. There's a lot of walk, duck, shoot repetition, which is quite dull. It is very annoying to be sent back to the start of the level when killed though, and there are no checkpoints at all as far as I can tell. Overall, I think this is an unremarkable port of what I personally think is quite a boring arcade game, but it does have longish levels and no multi-load, so it does offer some longevity if you're persistent enough to want to beat it. Game number 2 on this compilation is Gauntlet II, released by US Gold in 1987 and based on Atari's 1986 coin-op. Like its predecessor, Gauntlet II is a fantasy-themed top-down dungeon crawler game which supports 2 simultaneous players in this conversion. Players must make their way through a seemingly endless series of dungeons, eliminating a variety of creatures, collecting treasure, keys and magic potions before finding the exit to the next level and continuing the adventure. As in the original game, there are 4 character classes to play as: Warrior, Valkyrie, Wizard and Elf. The main difference from the original game is that players can now choose to play as the same class, each using a different colour. New level designs are available, including the possibility of encountering them in different ways by having the playfield turned in steps of 90 degrees. New environmental elements are also added, including invisible walls, magic walls which change into monsters or items when hit, stun tiles and fake exits. Another challenge in the game is the possibility of finding a secret room containing items such as food, magic and treasure by completing specific achievements within the level. There are also new creatures to encounter, such as the enemy It, which causes all enemies to be drawn towards the player it touches. The only way to release this curse is by touching another player or exiting the level. Another notable addition is the ability to ricochet shots off walls by means of a special pickup. The initial presentation in Gauntlet II is excellent, with an impressive title screen followed by a character selection screen that's unique to the home versions of the game. Once you get into the game itself, the graphics are a pretty convincing recreation of the arcade game, with lots of colour, though sometimes gaudy floor colours can be off-putting. You'll see an impressive number of enemies and items on screen at once, so it's certainly well programmed in that respect. Unfortunately, the sound doesn't match the graphics. It's very minimal, with no effects for picking up treasure for example, and there's no music at all in game. The sound effects in the arcade game were very memorable, so it's a shame more effort wasn't made to recreate them. The C64 was even capable of generating speech, so again, it's disappointing that the sound's so bare bones. Most of the coin-ops gameplay elements are present, and this version seems more generous with health, which stands to reason given it's not asking you to feed coins in to play. If you're playing it in 2-player mode, then it gives multiple continues per player, and it would definitely be much more fun with a friend. The game does feel quite sluggish at times, with movements of players being slow, and the speed and frequency of your shots also being rather lacking. This can make it quite laborious to get through levels, especially with the amount of enemies thrown at you right from the outset. There are minor improvements over the first game in terms of the items, enemies, weapons and traps, but I get a lot less nostalgia when I play this game compared to the original. Many of the new hazards are just annoying, such as freeze panels and invisible transporters, and again these slow progress down unnecessarily. I was a huge fan of Gauntlet when I was a kid, and this game would have been one of the main reasons for me wanting this compilation, but in retrospect the game is very samey, and playing it now is not long before it gets repetitive and boring. The multi-load would have been tedious on the tape version, but given how many levels there are, that was unavoidable. The game doesn't have the same appeal that it had when I was 12 years old, but this is a good conversion nonetheless, and can still provide some fun if you have a buddy to play alongside. Next up, it's another conversion of an Atari arcade game, again from 1986. This is 720 Degrees, which was originally published by US Gold in 1987. The player controls a skateboarder, and the object of the game is to perform stunts which accumulate points to earn tickets which give entry to the 4 skate parks. The 4 park events are downhill, jump, slalom and ramp, which is the halfpipe. Each park can only be visited once on each level of the game. You begin the game in Skate City, which is a central hub from which you can visit the 4 parks. Tickets are used as the parks are visited, and extra tickets are awarded at 5,000 points and every 10,000 points thereafter. Medals are awarded for good performance in each of the parks with cash prizes and bonus points. There are 4 shops in Skate City which sell either boards, helmets, pads or shoes. Shops display the price of the goods they sell, and approaching the counter at the correct place will result in a sale if you have enough money. Bonus points are awarded for any remaining cash at the end of the game. If a player does not enter the park within a time limit displayed on the status bar, he is pursued by killer bees. These become more dangerous if the player does not enter a park quickly. The player should also avoid contact with other characters appearing on the screen. Graphically, this one's a mixed bag. The isometric landscape looks pretty decent, but is lacking colour with an emphasis on drab grey and brown, which doesn't really reflect the colourful skating scene. The main character sprite is rather blocky, but does animate quite well, while the secondary characters are colourful but typically static. The scrolling is good for a game using this perspective, but the screen doesn't move until you're quite close to the edge, so you need to pay attention to react to what comes at you. The soundtrack fits the game well and is a good SID recreation of one of the coin-op's many tunes, which is only used on the downhill course in the arcade version. The gameplay can only be described as frantic. There are very strict time limits on choosing an event and then within the challenges as well, which means you barely have time to think about what you're doing. To make any serious progress, you need to do tricks on the Skate City map to earn enough points to get tickets, as well as earning medals in the different mini-games. You'll also need to level up your board and equipment to allow you to move faster, which helps avoid the bees. The slalom is the easiest event to earn points and money on, followed by the downhill, as long as you can work out how to get from one ramp to the next without falling off. The halfpipe is probably hardest, as you have to do loads of tricks to even get a bronze medal, and it's very easy to fall off your board without really knowing what you did wrong. I found the collision detection is sometimes iffy and the isometric perspective doesn't help, especially on the hub area where you can often miss timed jumps and turns and end up in the water. After a few plays to refresh my memory, I did eventually get to grips with the controls and improve on each event, which allows you to get further. It's still a hard game to master though and can be frustrating when you seemingly do the right thing but get punished. I loved skateboarding at the time this came out, so I probably gave it more time than it really deserved, as it is quite repetitive and annoying. It would have been nice if there was a free play mode with no bees in this home version, as skating around the mini open world doing tricks is probably the most fun part of the game. Much like Gauntlet 2, this is another reasonable conversion of a game that isn't actually that good in retrospect, and it certainly lacks the longevity of the first two games in this compilation beyond a high score challenge. Let's hit the road with the next game on this compilation. It's Outrun, originally released earlier in 1988 by US Gold and of course based on Sega's 1986 arcade classic. Here's a game that really needs no introduction or explanation, as it's one of the most well-known arcade games of all time that regularly features in top 10 lists. Take to the road in your Ferrari Testarossa convertible with a cool tune on the radio and try to complete 5 challenging stages racing across the USA. A timer begins to tick down as soon as the game starts, and if you don't reach the next checkpoint before it runs out, then the game will end. The roads twist and undulate and you must avoid traffic and roadside hazards to reach your destination. In the instructions for this compilation, it says Outrun must surely be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, home computer arcade version of all time. The computer game reproduces as faithfully as possible all the exciting elements of the Outrun arcade machine. If it was more realistic, you'd need a driving license to play. Now I think we all know that the game didn't live up to those lofty claims on any of the 8-bit systems, with many people being disappointed in the shortcomings of the home conversions. The C64 version received average reviews at best, but I don't think it was quite as bad as some of the magazines made out. For every bad point about this version, there's also a good one, and that's how I'm going to review it. Starting on the bad side, the car graphics are quite ugly and have a disappointing Spectrum-esque monochromatic look, and some of the landscapes aren't pretty either beyond the first stage. On the upside, the sprite scaling of the arcade version is recreated reasonably well, and it moves pretty fast for a 3D racing game on the C64. The animation of the car flying through the air when you crash is also really well done. It is missing one of the 3 music tracks from the arcade version, and the screeching brake noise on every bend is annoying, but the 2 tunes that are included are really good SID renditions of the beloved arcade themes, and really help make the game feel like Outrun. The biggest bugbear most people have with this version is that there's no branching road paths for each stage. That's a shame for sure, but to compensate for that there are 5 different courses available as separate loads from the tape, and at least the programmers didn't resort to having a multi-load for each stage like the Spectrum and Amstrad versions. It is a very challenging game with almost no margin for error, needing a near perfect run from the start to get to the later stages, and progress can sometimes be blocked by some annoying traffic that's hard to get past. With enough practice and memorising the route, you can make it through the 5 stages though, and the controls are pretty responsive, though you randomly always seem to start a new game in high gear. When all said and done, it was always going to be hard to convert Outrun to an 8-bit computer. The C64 conversions of Boogie Boy and Power Drift show that it is possible to do an excellent port of an arcade racing game, and while this isn't in the same league as those, it is a playable version of the most famous of all arcade racing games, and I still enjoy it despite its flaws. The final game on this compilation is a biggie, California Games, originally published by US Gold in 1987 and developed by the masters of multi-event sports games, Epix. California Games is a challenge of skills for 1 to 8 players and includes 6 exciting events: half-pipe skateboard, footbag, surfing, roller skating, BMX bike racing and flying disc. The object of the game is to win trophies in each individual event and compete for the top spot in overall competition. The first event is half-pipe skateboarding, the object of which is to ride the board back and forth on the ramp, performing stunts with proper timing and execution. You'll have a 1 minute 15 second time period or 3 falls to build up speed and successfully complete moves. Points are awarded for each stunt and the highest score wins the event. You can perform 3 moves depending on where on the half-pipe you execute a manoeuvre with the joystick. In the lower section of each side of the halfpipe you'll do a kick turn, on the upper section you'll do a hand plant, and if you manage to get high enough in the air you can perform a challenging aerial turn. In the foot bag or hacky sack event you have to keep a juggling bag in the air for 1 minute 15 seconds without using your hands. Success is all in the timing. If you time your kicks correctly you'll keep the bag bouncing high in the air and can score extra points by performing stunts. The highest score wins the event. Several types of manoeuvre are possible, including inside kicks, outside kicks, jumping reverse kicks, knee kicks and back kicks. You can also bounce the bag off your head. To perform different types of kicks you must move to new positions underneath the bag while it's in the air. The more complicated kicks and stunts you complete before the time runs out, the higher your score will be. Bonus points are also awarded for variety. The surfing competition is a game of staying near the curl of the wave and manoeuvring your board smoothly at high speeds. Ride the face of the wave moving back and forth in and out of the tube and use as much of the wave as you can before your ride comes to an end. You get 90 seconds for the event or 4 wipeouts. You're scored for the length of your ride, the number of turns you make and your speed each time you turn. You also earn higher points from the judges for riding underneath the curl of the wave and riding near the break. The more risks you take to do your stunts, the more points you'll earn. In the roller skating event you have to travel down a beach boardwalk without falling. You'll have to avoid cracks in the sidewalk, grass, sand, puddles of water, shoes lying in your path and much more. You must avoid the obstacles and cover the course in the best possible time, performing as many stunts as you can. You'll score points for each object you successfully avoid or jump over, and more complicated moves lead to higher scores. You must be careful not to fall more than twice though, or you'll be out of the competition. The BMX racing event takes place on an action-packed course down a California mountain. The object is to cover the course in the fastest possible time, performing stunts and avoiding or jumping over obstacles. You're allowed 1 serious fall or 3 easy falls before you're out of the race. If you flip and fall on your head, it's a serious fall. You should try to complete the course within the 2-minute time limit. The faster your time, the higher your score will be, and you'll also get bonus points for each stunt. The final event is the flying disc, or frisbee as it's more commonly known. The object of this event is to throw accurately to the catcher at the other end of the field. Points are awarded for the throw and the catch. For the throw, score points for the accuracy and height of the toss. The fewer steps the catcher has to run to meet the disc, the more points are awarded for the throw. To catch the disc you must meet it with your hands, and note that your hands are only extended when you're running or diving. Like all of the epic sports games, California Games has brilliant presentation, with an excellent title screen and a menu system that has loads of options, and great music on both. The graphics are superb across the board, with beautiful background scenery and great animation on your competitors, as well as humorous touches like the seagulls in the footbag event and the dolphins and sharks in the surfing. The sounds are generally decent and realistic to the events, and several of them have enjoyable music while playing too, though it would have been nicer if all of them did. The 6 events are all really well designed and programmed, but the difficulty level is very unbalanced between them. In the halfpipe it's very hard to time the turns and you end up crashing out most of the time. You can only do turns if you're facing the right direction into the ramp, so you have to wait if you don't make it the first time. It seems almost impossible to do the moves higher up the ramp as it's difficult to get enough speed up and get the timing right. Therefore the only safe move is to do kick turns over and over again, which just gets boring, and even then there seems to be just a split second between performing a good turn or failing. It's just too unforgiving. It's by far the most frustrating of all the events and takes a huge amount of practice to do even the basics, and it just makes me want to play the skate or die halfpipe event, which is much better implemented and more fun, even if the graphics aren't quite as good. Footbag is probably the most obscure event in the game, but it's really fun to try and chain moves together and mix things up to earn the big variety bonus. It doesn't need as much practice as some of the other events to get a decent score on, but the more you play the better your timing will get and the more complex moves you can put together, earning the bigger scores. It's always fun to try and hit the seagull too. The animation of your player is a little stiff, but the backgrounds are really nice and the controls are intuitive once you've played it a few times, as you'll learn that you need to face forward to be able to move left and right faster. Surfing is definitely my favourite event in the game, as once you get to grips with how to do the aerials and ride close to the break, it's really satisfying. It's probably not very realistic how long you last, but it's a lot of fun and could easily have been released as a great standalone game. The animation of the waves in your player is really good, the background music is excellent, and the controls are both responsive and intuitive. It's also quite forgiving and one of the easier events to pick up and play without too much practice. I think the roller skating event is the least impressive graphically, having a grey beach for reasons unknown and some poorly defined background images. This is the closest thing to a joystick waggler in this game, as you have to roll the stick up and down to maintain speed. There is some up and down control as well, but the fire button sometimes seems unresponsive when trying to jump. This is one of the events that's really difficult to complete, as you can only fall 3 times before you're disqualified, and the course is long with a lot of hazards. It's sometimes unfair too, as you'll restart after falling and immediately hit the next obstacle without being able to avoid it. Coming straight after that is the BMX event, which is equally as hard to complete for many of the same reasons. It has a weird, mildly isometric perspective and it's very easy to hit the sides of the track or objects that you think you'll miss. The controls are okay, but again, the game doesn't always seem to respond to pressing the joystick button to jump. It's very hard to do mid-air tricks with any confidence, and in fact the whole thing is very hard and quite frustrating. It does have really nice graphics and animation, but the sound effects are quite average on this one. Flying Disc has some lovely parallax scrolling and is the simplest of the 6 games, as you just have to stop the needle in the green spots on the power gauge to throw the disc, then position the other person to catch it. Catching it on the right hand side of the recipient is easy, so the real challenge is to time the catch on the left side or overhead for extra points, and I've never managed the latter. It is satisfying to catch the frisbee just before it hits the ground, but overall this is the least interesting of the 6 events. I know many people rate California Games as the best in the Epix Games series, but personally I prefer World Games. This one is very good but has less events to compete in, and the difficulty of some of them does get frustrating. BMX, skating and halfpipe in particular need an awful lot of practice, but the practice modes for those 3 don't equate to the standard gameplay mode as they reset after you've fallen once. This means it's hard to get into the latter stages and more challenging moves. I'll be honest and say I never really put a lot of time into this back when I had this compilation due to the multi-load, which is pretty tiresome having used it again to record the footage for this video. I have rectified that to some extent though, as this was easily the most time I've ever spent trying to get half decent at a game in this series so far, to the point where I just started to get annoyed with certain events. Having said that, there's no doubt this is an excellent collection of unusual sports games if you put the time in, and as I said, the overall presentation is exemplary. It's now time to move on to the compilation rating, and I'm sure you know the drill by now. I'll give each game an individual score before rating the compilation overall. Let's begin with Rolling Thunder, and for me this is the worst game in this collection, being an average conversion of a rather boring arcade game. That said, it is still fairly playable, so I'm going to give it a score of 6 out of 10. Gauntlet II is a solid conversion of Atari's arcade coin muncher, with good presentation and lots of levels to play through if you can be bothered. For me it's a repetitive game that quickly loses my interest, but it would be a lot more fun with 2 players, and I'm going to give it a score of 7. 720 Degrees is not very pretty to look at, and the frantic gameplay can often be frustrating, but it does recreate the arcade game well and the music is enjoyable, so I'm going to give it a score of 6. As a conversion of Sega's iconic arcade game, Outrun's lacking in many respects, but porting this technically advanced game to any 8-bit system was always going to be a challenge. Viewed as a C64 3D racing game, it's playable and fun despite the graphical shortcomings, and the music is awesome, so I'm going to give it a score of 7 out of 10. Rounding out the compilation is California Games. It's not my personal favourite of the Epix Games series due to the difficulty level of some of the events, but the presentation and graphics are fantastic, the surfing and footbag are tons of fun, and it's comfortably the best game on this compilation, so I'm giving it a score of 8. If like me you were looking for a compilation of big name arcade titles for Christmas in 1988, then there weren't many that looked better than Giants. In retrospect, some of the games aren't brilliant, but they're all solid enough to be worth playing for a while, and you certainly get good variety with a shooter, dungeon crawler, racer and 2 cool sports titles. So let's get on and rate this compilation, starting with the packaging. And this big box package exudes quality with an excellent front cover image, and the instructions are comprehensive for all 5 games. The only letdown is the back of the box, which lacks both screenshots and overviews of the games. It's very much relying on you knowing the big name titles rather than selling them to you, so with all things considered I'm giving it a packaging score of 8 out of 10. The average score for the 5 games in this package comes out at 6.8, so that just leaves the value for money score. 5 titles for $12.99 puts each game at roughly budget price, and that makes a couple of them bargains in my view. It is more expensive than similar arcade-centric compilations of this time though, such as Ocean's We Are the Champions, and not all of the games would have kept you hooked for long, so I'm going to give it a value for money score of 8. So taking all those scores into consideration, the overall compilation rating for Giants comes out at 73%. Just as it was heavily advertised in the pages of the computing magazines of the time, and possibly because of that, Giants also received quite a bit of review coverage. So let's take a look at 3 different magazine reviews, all of which came from the January 1989 editions of the respective magazines, which were of course published in December 1988. I'll start with Zap64 and their semi-regular roundup of compilations, this time called Compiler Facts 2. And Giants is one of 3 compilations featured on the first page of this feature, and they've chosen a very strange screenshot to represent it, the character selection screen from Gauntlet II. It's also worth noting that they've got this listed at costing $14.99 on cassette and $17.99 on disc. As for the content, they say Gauntlet 2 is a mediocre sequel to the decent original arcade conversion, which I think is a little harsh. They say Rolling Thunder is a graphically poor but very playable conversion of the unspectacular coin-op, which I definitely agree with. California Games is simply brilliant and probably the best of the games series. Well, I've made my thoughts on that perfectly clear already, so let's move on to 720 Degrees, which they say is an enjoyable and faithful conversion of the fun skate about, if a bit poor graphically. Again, I'd agree with that one. And finally, for Outrun, they say it's a reasonable attempt at catching the spirit of the coin-op, but without the detailed speed or hydraulic chair, it's only just above average, and again, I can't argue with that too much. They give Giants an overall rating of 69%, saying a collection of great names, but apart from California Games, the games are not so great. At £15 you should think twice and maybe look around for the better games in a bargain bucket. Now, as we know, this was actually released at $12.99 on cassette, so perhaps they'd have been a little bit more generous with the score if they'd taken that into consideration. Let's move on to the pages of Advanced Computer Entertainment, or ACE for short, who gave a comprehensive roundup of compilations from a number of the big publishers in their budget games section. For US Gold, they looked at 3 compilations, of which Giants was the first, saying, let's face it, if anybody's got a fair amount of good product to offer in a compilation, it's US Gold. A number of Christmas #1s under its belt for sure, and Giants has most of them. It says this again is chock-a-block with coin-ops like Gauntlet, Rolling Thunder, 720 Degrees and Outrun, but then goes on to say the only fly in the ointment is California Games. This was hailed as the worst game of all time on certain formats and just plain vanilla on most others, but the other crucial blockbusters in the package more than make up for CG's complete lack of luster. I find that completely bizarre because California Games was rated 10 out of 10 in computer and video games and given a score of 97% in Zap. I think the reviews of the Spectrum version were a mixed bag, and I'm not sure how the Amstrad version fared in the magazines, but I find it hard to believe it was rated as the worst game of all time on any format. The review goes on to talk about the 4 arcade ports in varying levels of detail, although it's talking about Gauntlet rather than Gauntlet II. It said that 720 Degrees and Rolling Thunder had their moments, and to some the Spectrum versions were the best players, which I can't really argue with because I've never played them. The reviewer then rambles on for a couple of paragraphs about Outrun, but to be honest, there's very little critique of any of the titles in this review other than California Games, and based on what was said about that, it's hard to take this one seriously, so let's move on to the final review, which comes from Computer and Video Games. Like the other magazines, their review of Giants comes as part of a big feature called Compilation City, and it's Julian Rignall giving his thoughts on which compilations offer the best value for money. Just like Ace, Computer and Video Games is a multi-format magazine of course, but it does make it clear here that the version being reviewed is the Commodore 64 one. It is a very small review, but for California Games they say 7 wacky events from the West Coast, superb stuff. It was actually 6 events, but we'll let them off. It describes 720 Degrees as a blocky but competent skateboarding arcade conversion, Gauntlet II as a good but aging conversion of the coin-op classic, Outrun as a big seller but very average in all respects, and Rolling Thunder as a ghastly coin-op conversion. I don't necessarily agree with all those comments, but it rounds up the review saying it's a reasonable collection with 1 outstanding game and 1 bummer, giving it an overall score of 78%. 3 marginally differing reviews from the mags there, but if you put aside the bizarre comments from Ace, which to be fair was a multi-format magazine and review, I don't think the views of Zap and C and VG differ too much from my own. And if you were to even out their respective scores of 69% and 78% for Giants, you get an average of 73.5%, which is almost exactly what I gave it. So let's just agree to agree and move on to see where this compilation has ended up in my league table. Looking at the full price compilation rankings first, Giants has gone in at 4th place, nudging Arcade Hall of Fame, another US Gold compilation, down to 5th. And I think that's fair because I definitely think the games on Giants are generally of higher quality than those on Arcade Hall of Fame, but I'd also say the lineup's not as appealing to me as those on the 3 compilations that rank above it. And skipping over to the compilation rankings including budget compilations, well, it's the same story, because none of the budget compilations come close to the top 5 full price ones thus far. That brings my review of Giants to an end, and this was a fun trip down memory lane for me, looking at a compilation that I had 35 years ago. And to be honest, I don't think my opinion on any of the games has changed too much since then. But how about you? Let me know in the comments what you think about these 5 games and the compilation as a whole. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, and if you're not subscribed to my channel already, then please do so for more great retro gaming content. I'll be back with another Commodore 64 compilation comparison next month, and lots of other retro gaming content in the meantime, so until then, thanks very much for watching, and catch you next time.